unfortunately. So
Okay, completely okay. So I thought maybe just for the hell of it tonight, how does fur construction sound?
Sounds very
ooh.
interesting.
Okay, so that is what we're going to learn tonight. Is
Cool.
so Marguerite, does that sound okay to you? Or
It's fine for somebody that is vegan.
well, this is fake.
I
Yeah.
will never do anything with fur, but
But this is fake fur. This
okay.
is not real fur.
Okay.
See, the methods translate to both, but you can enjoy this knowing that no animals were harmed in the production of these videos.
Okay, sounds
Okay.
good.
Okay, so let us begin. So there are 3 videos. Let's see, fake fur 1. So let us start with this one. Where is it? Oh, here we are. And then, and so, yeah, as always, if there are questions, don't be shy. And so we shall begin. This is a class on sewing fake fur. These are just 3 examples of the variety of the fake furs out there on the market. So this class will be on how to work with fake fur. This would also apply to real fur if you are so inclined. We have so much work to do. Let's get started. We begin with marking tools. Here is an array of marking tools. I'm going to first start with permanent markers. These are good, I would say, for fake fur. If you're working with real, I would caution against them because the ink might bleed through and you might see it from the front. But these are quite effective for marking fake fur. Then you have artists' pencils. These are Barol Prismacolor pencils. And I like the Barol Prismacolor because they're waxy and it sticks to the back of the fake fur, so it leaves a good mark. You can get them in light colors, you can get them in dark colors. But then these here, this is wax chalk, different colors. Wax chalk, as opposed to a clay chalk, sticks more readily to the back of the fur and it will stay in place longer. So here you have the basic marking tools, something you probably already have in your workspace. Cutting tools are very important when cutting fur. You want your tools sharp and you want to minimize the loss of the nap itself. So first, I'm going to start with just a very sharp pair of scissors. I'll be demonstrating these when we demonstrate cutting. This is a pair of tailor points. You could use a pair of shears. This is the least desirable tool for cutting. You run the risk of losing a little more nap than you should. But if you don't have anything else, you can make this work, and I will show you how. Then we have single edge razor blades. Because when you're cutting, you're going to be cutting from the back, and you want to cut the backing of the fur and try to avoid cutting the nap. So single edge razor blades are readily available and you change them frequently. Another cutting tool is the X-Acto knife. Again, you can buy the multi-pack of the blades and change your blades frequently. This is a scalpel, the Futura safety scalpel. And this is, if you have friends who are in the medical industry, this is where you would get them. And this is the scalpel. It has a little button that you push. There we go, it clicks. And then there is the blade. It's extremely sharp. Be very careful with this. And see, then you can push this. There it is. To retract the blade. So when working with this, you want to have the blade out to cut and retract it for safety's sake. And finally, this is what's called a fur knife. It runs with single edge razor blades in just a moment, I'm going to demonstrate how this particular tool works. So we have cutting tools. So on to a demonstration of this. So this is the fur knife that I referred to in the last section. And you notice I have extra blades. I also have a hard-sided eyeglass case. This is old, but since this doesn't have any kind of retractability in the blade, you want to store it in a container that the blade can't cut through. So this is hard-sided. Okay, so here, this is what the blades look like. You can buy them by the 100 pack at any place that sells this particular device. And really what it is they've split a double-edged razor blade into two parts. So when you get one of these envelopes, you have two blades. How this works, this latch here unlocks the holder, and then you come in here and there are two parts. You swing this open. There's the blade. So now put this down. You want to be extremely careful because these are extremely sharp and you could injure yourself very quickly. So I always like to set it up. And then this here, you lift the blade out and you set the new blade in like so. And then this snaps in place and you put the latch on. And from here, you put that back in the case, safety first. And then what I will do with this is put some Scotch tape over this, or you could tape it to a piece of paper before you throw it away. Don't just throw it in the garbage because your hand will catch it. I've gone over to my tape dispenser, torn off a piece of tape. So this is what you'll do.
Kenneth?
Yes.
Then you
I went to the pharmacy and I bought a Sharps container and I put all my blades and everything in the Sharps container.
Okay.
Just-
That's good to know.
Yeah, and they come in different sizes because I know that our garbage company at least does not want you putting any pins or sharp things in the garbage. So,
Well, that's good to know. That's, I never thought to do that, but thank you for that tip.
yeah.
this into the garbage. So much for cutting tools. Next, sewing tools. Aside from your sewing machine, these plus pins are your sewing tools. You'll get a demonstration of all of this, but this is just a hair pick. You get this in the hair department in your local drugstore. This will help you to manage the nap when you're pushing the nap down between the layers to sew the seam. And after you've sewn the seam, then you use this hairbrush, and that's what it is, to brush over the seam to meld the nap so that the seam disappears. If you're working on a short-haired fur, I found that this dog brush, and that's what it is, works a little better than this one for short-haired furs. It helps to even out the surface of a short-haired fur. And then finally, this here, if you're working with an extremely long-haired fur, this will help you to lift everything up and smooth it out. So, who knew you could get sewing tools at the drugstore? One more tool that you can get from the barber supply or the beauty supply place is a hair clipper. This is what it looks like, just a garden variety clipper. You could also get a beard trimmer. And these don't have to be as sharp as if you were going to use it on your hair, but this is for the times when we do what's called a shaved seam, which you're going to see. Hair clipper. And as far as sewing supplies, aside from just regular garden variety thread, you want this. This is called cold tape. You can get it 1/4 inch wide, get it 3/8 inch wide. It comes in black, brown, and I believe white. What this is really, it's just taffeta. It's a fabric tape that's gummed. It has stickum on the other side. So when you're sewing seams in any kind of fur, you want to use this to stabilize the seam. Otherwise, the seams will stretch greatly. This will become more understandable once we actually start sewing. But the cold tape, fairly easy to find. It also works if you're sewing leather and need to stay a seam. You can do a stand-in of 1/4 inch wide, just regular twill tape and Elmer's glue. You'd have to glue it down and let it dry before you could sew, but that is a workaround if you don't have the cold tape. So we've covered some tools and materials. Now let's start sewing. Before you begin cutting, the one thing that you really want to do is to mark the direction of the nap on the back of the fur. You want to know which way the nap points so that you don't get confused. I'm a little bit dyslexic, so I like to do this before I begin. What I have done here is I've marked out on the fur the cut lines for the little samples that we're going to be making. So once you have the cut lines marked, I'm going to show the different ways of cutting the fur. The first way is with the scissors. The object, if you're cutting with scissors, is to slide the blade along the backing of the fabric. And by having the blade slide right along the back of the fabric, you can make a relatively clean cut. It's not my preferred way of working, but it certainly does work. Now, when you're cutting, whether it be this method or any of the other methods, the object obviously is to not cut the nap. But the other thing you want to do is you want to have a vacuum cleaner close at hand. We haven't lost a lot of nap on this, but sometimes you do. You want to vacuum the fur with every cut. You don't want to breathe this in. That's not healthy. Next, I'm going to show you cutting with the blade. Cutting with the blade works with any of the blades, but I'm going to show you using the fur knife. And when you're using a fur knife, you really want fresh blades because give it a little bit of a pull, and it's just like butter. So again, you're going to lose a little bit of nap, but the object is to not lose more than you have to. So this is cutting with the knife. Now, I'm going to talk about next using the cold tape when you're cutting. When you use the cold tape, you want to stay one side of the seam. So since we're going to be setting up our sample for the basic seam, we want to stay one side. So what you will do is apply the cold tape. When you're making what's called a hinge seam, which is the basic seam that we're going to be sewing next, you don't have seam allowances. The seam allowances are removed. You're sewing edge to edge, and the seam is on the stitching line. There are no seam allowances. So here, what I've done is I put the cold tape on the inside of one of the stitching lines. And then, again, it's a simple matter. Just napping right next to it. You try not to cut through. If you get it a little bit, it's not going to kill you. There we are. So that is how you set up for the basic seam. One side gets stayed, the other not.
Kenneth, can I ask you a question?
Yes,
The backing on this looks like it's a knit. Is it
Yes.
knit
it
or
is.
is it?
There are two different kind of backings on fur. There's knit backing and then there's woven backing. Now, if you're working with the fur that has a woven backing, you would use what's called a shaved seam, which is something we'll see later. But
Okay.
since this is a knit, it is closer to a real fur. And this is why you can then go without seam allowances and sew with the hinge seam.
Okay.
Okay.
Mhm.
Now that we have the two pieces ready to sew together, this is where our hair pick comes in. You want to brush all of the nap because you want the nap not to catch in the stitching. So I like to pin and work as I go. So you're going to pin the edges together like this. Go, you just use this comb to brush everything so that all the nap falls between the two layers. Now, if you were sewing a seam on an actual coat, you would have matching notches because you pin it with the tape uppermost because this will have a little more stretch. And so what you could do is match it at the matching notches so that you don't end up stretching the underlayer because you will. But since this is a sample, I'm just going to go through the process here. Pins are about 1/8 of an inch away from the cut edge. Now, some people ask, well, why don't you use binder clips or something? I find this is a little more reliable. If you were working with a real skin, you might use the binder clips instead. But since this is really, the fur has kind of a knit backing, I just find it's quite all right. It's completely okay to pin into this. So.
I'm sorry, I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
You wouldn't take down the fur part from at least one of the seams, one
no.
side of the seam at this point? No?
No, because
Okay.
what this is going to be, what's called a hinge seam, and so essentially what we're doing is sewing it edge to edge, so there's no seam allowance.
Ah,
But later,
okay.
you know, and I talked about, and we'll cover this later, what's called a shaved seam, where, you know, especially if you're working with a woven fur, the woven fur, if you sew a hinge seam, it just won't hold together. It'll just pull loose. And so in those cases, yes, you would actually shave down the fur down to the ground fabric.
I understand. Thank you.
I actually have just one other thing.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
noticed you're working like in the nap direction. Is
Yeah.
that standard? Like you always work nap down?
You know, not really. You just,
No?
I find that, you know, it kind of ends up that way when I'm sewing, but, you know, as long as you have the fur, as long as you keep the nap kind of down between the layers,
Okay.
you can have it so it nap up, nap down, but I just find it's easier
Because yeah.
because
Okay.
I'm right-handed with the comb. I guess that would be the best way of saying that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yep.
A little aside to know, you can sew it with Frankenstein stitches, no one will know. So your first project, people will think you're brilliant. Okay, so here we have this. Before we go to the machine, what we're going to do is we're going to overcast all of this with a zigzag stitch. And we're creating what is called a hinge seam. So we have everything pinned together, and more pins rather than fewer. Next, we go over to the machine. Here we are at the machine, and as sewing tools go, having a stiletto or a knitting needle to help guide the work through is going to be a good idea. So here, I have put on the open toe embroidery foot. You could use a zipper foot, you could use a regular presser foot if you want. I have found that the open toe embroidery foot really helps me to see what I'm doing a little easier, because let me zoom in here. The object of the game is we're going to be overcasting this so you can steer everything by the pins and or the stiletto. So the stitch length, this is a zigzag. The width is 3.5. The stitch length is 2.5. This is just a really good set of numbers just to use for sewing fur. It's long enough, but it's short enough. It's short enough to be secure, but long enough so it doesn't take forever to sew a seam. And as you move along, make sure that the needle catches on the left swing, it catches both layers, and it'll somewhat fall off the edge on the right swing. If it doesn't completely fall off the edge on the right swing, that's not going to kill you. Just going to keep sewing. Having the needle stop down on the machine, if you have that option for your machine, that is going to be a good idea as well. So you can see here, I'm using the stiletto. And when it stops, I always like to stop it on the left because it's the needle is seam. And you'll, when we go back to the work tape, see on the end here. Okay, here we are. So I will move this from the machine. Get a little close up here. Zoom it out a little bit. So that's what we have so far. I've used black thread on the back. Now I'll take it over to the work table to finish this up. So here we have the work back from the machine. Now, the object here is we want, because this is going to be a hinge, we're going to push with your thumbnail. See how the stitches somewhat open up? And kind of pull it this way as you're pushing. So this opens up like a hinge. So you have sewn the two layers essentially edge to edge. See how that looks? Work down to the end. See how easy this is? And like I said, if you're working with a long-haired fur, people will think your sewing skills are brilliant. Now we turn it over. And even without brushing, the seam disappears. But what I'm going to do here is just brush it one way, brush it the other way so that all the nap has a chance to kind of sort out. Give it a shake. And there you have it. You have no idea where that seam is. And this is what it looks like from the reverse. Here we have the hinge seam.
So questions on that? And see, Marguerite, no animals were harmed. This is a friend of mine, because when I did the fur DVD for Threads, I had to have so many kind of different parts and pieces that I was able to make a complete second coat. And so a friend of mine, she calls it vegan fur. So, I called her and I said, would you like a vegan fur? Because I have this extra fur coat that I don't need. So she was actually delighted to get it. So, yeah. So shall we continue?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's so cool.
Okay, so now other things. There we are. So now we're going to do some other techniques with this. So
Sewing a dart is somewhat like making a hinge seam. So what we're going to do here, zoom in a little bit. So when I'm sewing a dart, what I like to do is tape down one side with the cold tape, like so. Trim this off. Then I like to just make 2 crosswise pieces with the cold tape, so I know where the dart begins and where it ends. From here, this is where we get the knife. I'm going to turn this way. Dart out. For those who didn't know what that actually was called, it's called a return. So really, this one first, and then this one here. Ticklish business, but okay. Here we have it. This is where we take this out. To keep everything from pulling back this way, it works better to pull it towards the front. That keeps the hair going that way. Next, we pin. We pin the dart just like we pin the hinge seam, because really, that's what this is. It's a hinge seam. So again, more pins rather than fewer. Now that everything is pinned, we go off to the machine. As before, we sew with the stitch with a zigzag stitch. The width is 3.5, length is 2.5. So we're just, again, overcasting so that both of these raw edges are going to sew edge to edge. Here again is you don't want it to be seen. You want it to be sturdy though. Zoom out a little bit. That's what it looks like. And back to the work table. are. As we did on the basic seam, I'm going to push with your thumbnail so that everything opens up like so. You just stretch and push. Because obviously you don't want to press this because pressing is going to ruin the fur. So that's what it looks like from this side. And then we flip it over. And again, give it a little brush. Okay. Other way. And the dart completely disappears. From the back and the front. See a little bit of a shadow here, but what you can do is come in there and just work it. And voila, sewing a dart. The next technique I'm going to be showing you involves a little bit of explanation. Now this, as you can see here, is one of my coats. And you can see here, we have the lining and the fur. You can see how the lining joins the facing. Now, what I'm going to show you up close is, if you pull this, you can see there's another strip that the lining sews to. When you're sewing a smooth fabric to a fur, you don't really want to stitch through the fur if you can avoid it, because it ends up dragging the nap through the stitches and it just makes a mess. Show it to you here as well. So you can see I've sewn a bias strip to the fur, and then I use this to sew the hem to the face fabric, and then sew the lining to the hem. So this is one explanation for why you want to sew a bias strip to an edge of the fur. It is so that whatever you sew to the fur, you're not really sewing through the fur, you're sewing through fabric. Now that I have explained that, we can proceed with the lesson. Adding the bias strip to the fur can be either worked on straight lines or it can be worked on curved lines. So I'm going to use a curved line here. I've cut some muslin on the bias. You can use muslin, you can use your lining fabric. That's entirely up to you. So to begin, we first want to lay down the cold tape. And on this, if it's going around the curve, you can stretch it a little bit. It will work itself around the curve. If it ripples in this area, that's not going to kill you. You just want to be able to have the edge of the cold tape on the drawn line. And there we are. Zoom in on this a little bit so you can see. So yeah, if it wrinkles a little bit, that's not fatal. From here, this is where we cut this along the edge. And so having this cold tape is going to stay this curve so it doesn't stretch. That's another advantage of the cold tape. Again, with your cutting tools, change the blades frequently. You can buy a 100 pack that is what I've done. And especially when you're working on fake fur, the blades dull more quickly because you're working with man-made fibers. Okay, so here we have this. And have the bias strip. We are ready for the next step. So here, what we're going to do is push the fur in and everything together. Since this is a bias strip, it will want to shape around this curve. But again, more pins rather than fewer. And coming to the end. Okay, here we are at the end. So again, this is what we have. We will again go to the sewing machine. As before, with this 3.5, stitch length is 2. So we're overcasting. Sorry about that. Sewing these two together. Now, if you were sewing this in a lining, this cut edge represents where normally you would sew the seam to join the lining. So there really would not be a seam allowance then on this as your finish. The lining, of course, would have a seam along the edge, and so you can slip stitch it to this strip. Just a really effective way to sew when you're hand sewing, to have something to sew to, not fur. The word faux, spelled F-A-U-X, means fake. It's teaching a class on this in Toronto, and they build the class as sewing. People didn't take it because they thought I was sewing with fox. Pull back a little bit. What it looks like from this side and from this side. Now, back to the work table. Now, if this were, say, a fur collar, you'd have a pad, and then you would bring this all around catch here. If you catch some in there, you can comb it. So then or if this were, say, the hem on a jacket, same thing. You would pull it over a little more, but we're imitating a collar here. Here we are. So you can see, you can even that out a little bit. And so at this point, you would just thread up your needle. You would just sew. Bring that in a little bit. There we go. You would just sew with a running stitch because really, it's fur. You're not going to see this from the front. Okay, almost finished. Sorry about that. Should have trimmed my threads. Okay, secure your thread. Love this troll doll hair. So here you have nice finished edge. And then next, I'm going to show you on just a little section how you put the fabric on, say if you're going to be putting a lining on. So here I've made a lining. You can see I've turned the edges over. So what you're going to do, bring this in here, you're going to run the folded edge of your lining up to where the bias strip joins the fur. Now, this shows I like to match the bias strip to the lining. So as you remember from the example I showed you earlier, you don't really see it. It kind of disappears. So if there, if you push the fur back a little bit, there's no harm, no foul. The eye doesn't pick it up. And so from here, zoom this back out, you sew it with the slip stitch. So I will go off camera and sew it with the slip stitch and bring it back and show you the result. And here we have the lining sewn on. And you can see if I really give it a tug, you can see where the stitching is. But in normal use, it just disappears. But you notice there are no bits of the nap in the stitching. So this is why you would put a bias strip on the edge of the fur to finish edges in different ways. There you have it.
So how are we all doing? Is this like watching paint dry, or is this enjoyable?
I'm enjoying it.
I'm enjoying it. I'm looking for this cold tape, and so far no luck.
Well, you know, the Silthread carries it in New York City. Let's see. If you look at leather places or furrier supply places, they have it. The workaround, like I said, the workaround is just using a regular, like off the shelf, 1/4 inch wide twill tape and Elmer's glue. You have to wait till the glue dries, but that is completely sufficient to do exactly the same job.
Cool.
How much ease do you add to a garment when making something out of fake fur.
I would just cut it, if it was going to be a coat, I would add the same wearing ease as a coat. And so as I learned wearing ease from my teacher, 2 inches is like the minimum. That gives you something that's a fairly close fit. 4 inches would be like a jacket, and 6 inches would be a coat that you would wear over other clothes. So that's kind of a good general rule to hew towards. It isn't like the fur takes up wearing ease, because the fur is kind of on the outside.
Mhm.
It's just, it appears to take up space, but it really doesn't.
Okay.
And and what I do love about long-haired furs, especially, because see, I have done, and people ask me, well, how did you learn how to do this? By taking apart a lot of fur coats. And I tell my students, you learn about clothing by looking at clothing. And so I have restyled a number of coats in my day. And so what I am constantly amazed at with coats that are from very good furriers, how much the insides look like the Frankenstein monster.
Wow.
It's, I just look at them like, well, it is fur. You never see that from the outside, but on the inside, they're like, big old stitches and such. So, it's been very instructive. But the thing I did learn though, is that long-haired furs are more forgiving than short-haired furs. Short-haired furs, your margin for error is very slim. Okay, so one more. This is where we do the shaved seam. This is for, if you're going to be sewing like woven fur, if you want to actually sew fur to a smooth fabric, because sometimes you want to do that. So here we go.
This is what's called a shaved seam. You don't see it from the front of the fur, obviously. When you turn it over, you can see that you have a full seam allowance, but we have shaved the nap from the ground fabric. Now this works better. This is a knit ground on this particular fur. There are some furs that are woven where the hinge seam is not quite as strong. So this would be a good option for that. Another option is if you're sewing with mohair velvet, this makes sewing that much easier. So let's begin. This is where our hair clipper comes in, because the term shaved seam is just that. You're shaving the nap from the fur. So what I've done here, you can see I put a piece of tape and I've made marks 5/8 of an inch in from each edge, because the seam allowance is going to be 5/8 of an inch. We are actually cutting seam allowances for this particular seam. So this is going to be how we set up our tool to perform our seam. For the shaved seam, as opposed to the hinge seam, we actually do cut seam allowances. Now, the explanation for this, on some furs, like this one, you have a knit background, which is more stable. Other furs and heavy velvets have a woven background. The hinge seam doesn't hold for them, so you need to actually add a seam allowance. So, like I said, with the clipper, we're going to actually shave the nap from the fur in the seam allowances before we assemble. I'll demonstrate. This is where the clipper comes in. So this will be a little bit loud. Sorry about that. So really, what we're doing is we're going to be using that mark as the guide against the edge of the fur. And we're going to shave away the fur. And what I like to do is first take it in the direction of the nap and then work opposite. So that's the first go. And then, this is why we have the mark on both edges shaved backwards. Really, the object here, you want to get as much of this fur off as you can. So shading it in 2 different passes is going to help you do that. So I'm going to shade this a little bit, show you what the result is. So here you can see when we're working, that is the first go. So you can see it didn't take it all the way down. This takes it, take it as far down to the ground fabric as you can. I will continue off camera to shave both seams, and I will bring everything back here. Okay, we have both sides shaved. Here then is brush the nap away from the seam allowances. And that will set us up for the next step, which is going to be putting the right sides together and pinning. When you're putting the right sides together, you just want to keep your pick handy, so you don't want to catch any of the nap in the seam if you can avoid it, and pin the 2 pieces together. It's fairly self-explanatory. And so that's what it's going to look like before we sew. Now, off to the machine to sew. So here we have the work under the foot of the machine, and I'm going to be sewing with a slight zigzag. The stitch length is going to be 3.5 and the width is going to be 0.5. Having a slight zigzag with all these thicknesses is going to keep the seam from drawing up. Much of a swing, but it's going to give a little bit of bounce so that you don't end up drawing. That's what it looks like from this side and from the back. Next, we'll go back to the work table to finish up. So here we are, back from the machine. And I'm going to flip this over on this side. And again, with your brush, brush everything out. So again, like I said before, you can sew it with Frankenstein stitches and no one will know. Now, one last thing I like to do to secure the seams is with needle and thread, is just catch stitch these flat. I find that it just works better because if you let these seam allowances kind of flop around inside the lining, because you're going to have a lining, sometimes they create strange ridges when you wear the fur. So it's just a good idea to tack them down. I will go off camera and tack the other side and bring you back the results. there we are. That is what it looks like from the back. And that is what it looks like from the front. And so we have it. Shaved seam. There will be times that you have to sew fur to a smooth fabric. This is what it looks like from the back, where all the seam allowances are tacked to the fur. And of course, this is what it looks like from the front. It's a variation of the shaved seam, and we're going to do that next. As you can see, I've shaved the nap off the seam allowance and brushed the nap away from the edge here. This is the right side of the fabric that we're going to be sewing it to. So I like to have the fur side up. And this is, again, you keep your pick handy just in case you have some errant strands of the nap that you need to control. And again, pin everything together. And then off to the machine. Again, we're at the machine, and we're just going to sew with a straight stitch. I like a longer one, about a 3.5 long. You don't want it too short. The flat fabric, the smooth fabric, stabilizes.
Sorry.
Now, if you have a walking foot, couldn't hurt to have that on, or if you want to base this with thread base before you sew it. All good as well. So here is what it looks like from the front and the back. Back to the work table. Here we have the work. And so now what we want to do is stitch the seam allowances back towards the fur. Now, you can't press fur. So this is just one of those times when you have to catch stitch it. So it doesn't take much, but holding all the seam allowances towards the fur is just a really good way of controlling the seam allowances. And also, when I finish this, when I turn it over, you'll see it gives the fur a nice appearance as it joins to the smooth fabric. And if you can see, I don't use a fancy catch stitch on this. I use just, this is what I call my catch stitch, but it works just fine. This will be in a lining anyway. So, I just like to give it a brush there to even it out. As it shakes out, having that seam allowance tacked towards the fur makes a nice roll. It wears quite nicely. Now, you see here, this is just a little observation. See, notice how the nap of the fur sticks to the muslin? I did that intentionally. When you're sewing a fabric to a fur, it works better if the fabric has a smooth texture as opposed to a matte texture, because that way you don't get this weird stickiness. But that said, it is quite attractive.
Now, how many people are going to go out and make themselves a fake fur coat?
Well, now I want to.
They're really fun to make. And some of the fake furs that are out are really quite wonderful.
Mhm.
You're showing on muslin, the
Yeah.
backing fabric.
Yes.
You would not do it on a duchesse satin?
Well, like I said, I chose muslin to show that, you want to, you know, you want a satin fabric or something so the fur doesn't kind of stick
Mm.
to it. And so just kind of having it on the satin, it wouldn't make the point quite so well. But so
Okay.
I wouldn't be sewing fur to any kind of matte finish fabric like a flannel or anything like that.
Mhm.
It would always be to something with a nice shiny surface so that it won't
Perfect.
stick.
Yeah,
When
because I can see a color coming in my life.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you could sew it just, not a whole fur coat, but just an accent like cuffs on a
Cuffs and collar.
sleeve or something
yeah.
like that would be nice, or on a hem.
Now that you have all of this information, I wrote an article for Threads magazine on how to make collar and cuffs.
Mm.
Oh, nice.
I
So,
probably have it somewhere.
yeah, and if you have the archive, you can just go in
I
the
do.
archive because you see,
Yeah.
I don't have any of the old issues anymore because I have the archive.
Right.
And what I do love about that archive is that you can just put in keywords and you get what you need. And, I can't remember which, because see, when we first got the archive, I had it in my mind that I had written only 3 articles.
You've written more than that.
Well, yeah, and so I thought, I just put them in, and then it was like, where did all these are? Then I remembered writing the articles, but sometimes I tend not to be real, sentimental about things, and I write it, send it off, it's gone, and then it falls out of my head, and I'm on to the next thing. But yeah, the archive's pretty cool.
I think I'm going to make color and a muff.
Oh, nice.
I've made muffs in the past. I went through this Tsarist Russian phase where I made evening muffs. It was fun, and they sold quite well in chilly Los Angeles.
Oh, they
He's
would.
elegant.
Yes.
Mhm.
Well, because you have it's like a handbag.
Mhm.
Keep your hands
Exactly.
warm, but there's like a place for your compact and your lipstick and your glasses and your cell phone and all of that stuff.
Hello, Montreal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Southwestern Ontario.
Same thing.
Yep. You get colder than we do.
You had snow, I think,
We-
today.
We
did
had
not.
freezing rain
Oh,
the night
merde.
before last,
Oh dear.
and snow earlier this week. And then it was
Mailed it.
warm today.
I wish for you spring like I wish for me.
I saw pussy willows today.
Oh, how nice.
So excited.
Well, we had some cold weather these last couple of days. It was like, I remember waking up in the middle of the night. It was just cold, and I thought, what is going on? I looked at my phone and it was 24 degrees.
Eef.
So I had to turn on the heat. But it's now back into, not cold
Oh,
weather, which is kind of
I
nice.
was going to say, define cold.
Well, no, it was
It's
24
not
degrees.
the same.
It's
So
below
would be,
freezing.
centigrade, it would be below 0 centigrade. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was
Okay.
It's below
for me,
freezing.
that was, for mid-March, that was unusual. But, I mean, the weather is just crazy these days. So now I don't know if you all follow me on Instagram, but
Mhm.
did you see my fabric?
I did.
I saw that today.
It's so
Beautiful.
pretty.
I
What are
would
you gonna do with
so,
Why are you
I'll probably
so-
make a jacket. But this
Mhm.
was at FIT. This was the swatch I took early on because they send, people send things to FIT, and I saw this. In the fabric room, they had it kind of rolled out on the table, and Angelo, the guy who kind of runs the place, I said, Angelo, can I have some of that? And he said, oh no, we have to save this for the students.
Really?
And
To ruin?
they had this, as just kind of because it was kind of ratty, so he just wanted to square it off. So this went into the rag bag, so I took it.
Yeah.
So I was here yesterday, and it's just there are times you just have to be at the right place at the right time. And so I said, Angelo, have they used that fabric? And he said, well, no, they're using that for the FD 134, which is the beginning students tailoring. So I like, okay, this luscious, gorgeous
You don't want to waste it on.
is going to be hacked up and made a hash of by some beginning student,
I mean, everyone has to learn, but
but not on
not
this.
with that.
No. And so I said, Angelo, that is far too difficult for those kids to work on.
Well, it would be. I mean,
Not really, but you know.
well.
And he said, well, you're not
Pretty.
bullshitting me. I'm like,
Oh.
no. Can I have some? So I think I ended up with like 3.5 yards. And I said, if you weren't married and I wasn't married, I'd kiss you full on the lips.
Oh.
But I don't think both of our husbands would like this. But yes, so I said to him, you have made me the happiest man in New York today, because it is, I mean, these are my colors. And it's just, what's so beautiful about it is it just looks like moss grew on the fabric.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's just this yummy, 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 yummy
Lovely.
texture.
So what are you
So-
gonna use for a lining?
I don't know yet. What I'm looking at is I'm thinking something like a leopard print or something like that. That it has to,
Something a bit wild.
it has to be really, really good. It can't be just like black satin. I mean,
Yeah.
that would be way too easy.
Not
So
even green satin or gold.
it's gotta be something really,
In your face.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I have I think I probably told you all about this. I have my jacket that I copied, an Yves Saint Laurent jacket, and I gave it peak lapels. That's going to be the pattern, because it actually
Ooh.
makes me look like I've got shoulders and a waist. So,
Nice.
which is, I mean, there comes that time where we realize, okay, we have to do whatever we can with what we have to make it look as good as we can. And so, yeah.
This is
but-
what we have. It's
Yeah.
not going to
And,
change.
you see, this is something I have to keep reminding myself, because when I was young, I had no idea what I looked like. I had no idea. And so, I have to remind myself that, okay, 10 years from now, I'm going to want to look like this. So, so yeah. So now I have, and I think I'll probably end up doing a video series on making this jacket. Well, I mean, why not? Because,
Why not?
why not? So,
Do
yeah.
you make clothes for your husband?
No. Well, actually, I take that back. He likes board shorts for the summer. He has Fortuny board shorts. And what's funny, in 2014, we went to Palm Springs. He has his friends Hervé and Thomas, who live in Paris. They were going to get married in Palm Springs. And so they rented Elizabeth Taylor's house,
Oh,
which was pretty swell. One of those mid-century
Mhm.
modern. Yeah. And so, I made Andrew a pair of Fortuny board shorts because I could. And what was so funny was, he went swimming around in the pool, and of course the chlorine in the pool started bleaching out the fabric, and everyone was having a conniption fit but me, and they were like, aren't you upset? I said, there's more where that came from. I can make another. So yeah, so I make him board shorts, but he dresses at Paul Stewart. He has, he has very specific things he likes. He
Mhm.
likes their clothes. And you see, I joke that we both have spent the same dollar amount on our wardrobes. I just have exponentially more items in my wardrobe than he does. He has the perfect navy blazer and the perfect gray flannels and the perfect window pane check jacket and the perfect like
Mhm.
it's very, it's a very limited range of clothes, but they're all of perfect quality. So,
And
that's
you're trying to say that what you make for yourself is not the perfect.
no, actually, I'm
Uh,
it's pretty swell, but it's so not his style.
And so it's style. It's just the
Yeah.
tailoring, the construction, the sewing, the planning, it's all either it's perfection, his style for so much money that he pays someone else, or you are able to do so for yourself.
Well, if he ever asked me, I would. But he's happy with the board shorts. And I know that sounds kind of kooky, but because people are kind of surprised because he kind of looks like Anderson Cooper. if you've seen posts of him on Instagram, you know, he actually goes to the same barber, gets the same haircut. You know, he has his style. And I have said to him in the past, you know, honey, I could make you a jacket, but getting him to let me do his mending, there was one time he called me and he had this hole in his pocket in his flannels. And I kept saying, honey, I can fix that.
Yeah.
Oh no, yes, it's part of my job. You know, I don't cook, but I can mend.
Just a
okay?
hole.
The hole. Come on, let's fix it because you might lose something.
Yeah.
Well, he called me one night. He lost a Tiffany money clip.
Shoot.
That was one that he got, like someone gave him. It was something that had a lot of meaning. He'd had it for years and years and years and years and years. So I, of course, didn't say, you know, if you'd let me, because I thought that's, you know, that would, no, that's wrong. Don't do that.
Well, and he knows that you know, and we're thinking.
Yeah, you know, and I know he knows I was thinking it. So I was like, just don't. It, you know, it was painful enough to lose it. So I
Yeah.
said, you know, I let a little time pass. So then I said, so honey, because see, I bought him a new money clip, a new Tiffany money clip for his birthday a couple of years ago. I said, so honey, may I have those trousers, please, so I can replace the pockets? And he kind of pushed back. I'm like, give them to me now, please. And so
We'll take time. Just
yeah. And so, you know, I was able, you know, I had to replace the bottom half of the pockets, and I have found a really good sturdy pocketing fabric that is going to take a while to wear through. And I also happily was able, when I was in there were some odd pieces of like the pocket applique that were just kind of flapping around in there that I could kind of trim off, because he has
Mhm.
one little hole, and he will take these to the French reweavers and have that hole rewoven, because now we have some pieces
Mhm.
for him to do that.
right.
So that's what I offer as a husband. So, you know, if he wants one, I would be happy to make him something, but you know, there you have
You
it.
don't wear board shorts in New York, do you? Does he?
Not
People
well,
don't wear board shorts in New,